Next, our top story. The Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly has indicated that sanctions against India are being considered following allegations of India's involvement in the alleged killing of the pro-Khalistan leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Now, New Delhi has completely rejected it, has said that the allegations made by Canada are utterly ludicrous, and India has expelled several Canadian diplomats, including their acting High Commissioner, in a tit-for-tat situation. Relations between India and Canada never worse than they are today. What's the way forward? How serious are the Canadian allegations, which have now been raised by their Prime Minister as well?
We'll continue to push India to make sure that they cooperate. We'll continue to engage with our Five Eyes partners. We'll continue to engage with also all our G7 partners, and everything is on the table.
Well, joining us now, Mr. Harsh Shringla, the former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to the United States, one of India's finest diplomats. Thanks so very much for being with us. Firstly, this entire rhetoric on there being potential sanctions against India, is that realistic at all? And B, how would you react?
I think 10 years, 15 years ago, we would have been very disturbed on hearing the word sanctions. It is a matter of concern traditionally. But I think we have come to a stage today, both in terms of the size of our economy and the confidence of our nation, that we are no longer intimidated by threats and coercion of this kind coming from a developed country. You heard the Foreign Minister of Canada, she used the word push India and, everything on the table. I don't think this is language that two friendly democracies really, exchange messages on the basis of. I think this is, really moral sanctimony of the most extreme kind. I think it also has connotations of a bygone era in which developed countries could push around developing countries. But this is a new India, and we will not tolerate this level of, I would say, attempts at intimidation. Sanctions today can invite counter sanctions. We believe that we are importing enough from Canada. There is a robust trade, but India also is buying a great deal from Canada. Both countries will be hurt. Sanctions don't necessarily mean that it would be applied on us and we would be at the receiving end. We also have the option of placing counter sanctions on Canada. And I think this is not the way to go. And certainly threats and intimidation, which has been the practice of the government of Prime Minister Trudeau ever since I think he took over as Prime Minister in order to pander to his narrow political vote bank, has not been, productive for the relationship or for the security and, well-being of his own citizens, Canadian citizens. Sure. You would recall, yes, please, go ahead.
Ambassador Shringla, is there anything by way of information that either Prime Minister Trudeau or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have revealed on this alleged plot involving India? Canada now says all the evidence has been submitted, but in terms of what Prime Minister Trudeau said, what the RCMP said earlier on, I didn't see anything remotely specific.
Yes, so apparently what has been the practice is to go to the public domain, whether it's in Parliament or a press conference or, a sort of a commission of inquiry, and speak of, investigation that brings out allegations that have, that are substantiated, that they've shared with us. But the government of India has been very clear. I think there's not a shred of evidence that is there with us which substantiates what the Canadian side is saying. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police yesterday in that press conference talked about links between Indian officials in India and criminal elements operating in Canada. And again, I didn't see anything that would link some of this. You need to link all the dots that you're talking about. You need to
Ambassador,
have
just
very,
that
very
point
substantial proof
that you're mentioning, A, Canada raises these allegations, B, they engage our High Commissioner, who's, I think, the senior most serving Indian diplomat right now, over a period of 1 year, and now they all of a sudden find him, say that, we want to question him, and the other diplomats. He's a person of interest. I mean, that sounds quite ludicrous.
Yeah, there's been a lot of inconsistencies in their position. And I think you're right in saying that not only have they engaged him, he's tried to bridge the gaps where, differences have arisen in our positions. But at the end of the process, they find him a person of interest in the investigation. High Commissioner Sanjay Verma, whom I know personally, is a person of impeccable credentials. He's been a diplomat of long standing, 35 years or more. And I think he's a thorough professional. I would not in any way say that he would be involved even remotely in anything of the nature that the Canadian government is casting aspersions on. And this is where I think things are going wrong. It's really off tangent, I would say.
Ambassador Shringla, one of the allegations made by the Canadians is that Indian diplomats have been seeking information from Canada and, in a sense, weaponizing that information. What does a diplomat do other than seek information? I mean, isn't that part of the job?
Of course, you seek information on the Canadian political scene, the economy, on individuals, political persons of interest, even people in the diaspora who could be useful or is linked to the relationship. But the fact of the matter is that our diplomats are professionals. We're talking about very senior diplomats that have been named in this particular instance, and they would never go down to the level of conducting what the Canadians are alleging in terms of keeping tabs on individuals for purposes that are mala fide in nature. So I think that is, as the Ministry of External Affairs calls it, a preposterous allegation.
How is there, Ambassador, a marked contrast in the way that the United States is dealing with similar allegations in the way that Ottawa is?
So if you see with the Canadians, we have been repeatedly requesting them to share evidence linked to their allegations. They have been talking about these allegations, as I said, in the public domain. You have Prime Minister Trudeau who goes to Parliament and announces that there are potential links, between the Indian government and some of the investigations that they're doing. He goes to press conferences and says that. He goes, in other public forum and announces this. This is grandstanding. And this, I think, is, in our view, for narrow, as I said, narrow political interests. The United States, on the other hand, has engaged us in a manner that is normal between two friendly democracies. They have said that there are allegations and that the two countries should work together. There are mechanisms between countries that allow for you to work together behind the scenes in a constructive manner so that you can provide whatever information is necessary and the two sides can work on what evidence might be available or not available, as the case may be. That is the contrast. I think one is a constructive engagement by the United States, and it's really quiet diplomacy. Have you ever heard President Biden talking about this, or any other senior official of the U.S. Government speaking about these allegations? Whereas in the case of Canada, you have the Prime Minister himself going up to the pulpit and announcing it for the entire world. The Foreign Minister talking about taking the help of the G7, the Five Eyes, and every possible developed country that could come to their support on this case. This is nothing but political grandstanding for their electorate, and that also a narrow base of their electorate. We have constantly said, let's work in dealing with those elements that are anti-national to both countries. They're involved in organized crimes, extortion, gun running, drug smuggling, human trafficking. They're involved in acts of terrorism. Let's deal with them together and let's deal with this menace. But the Canadians have ignored us, and this is to their own peril, because as you go down, you'll find that these elements will be detrimental to their own security and their own interests. This happened in 1985 when India asked for the extradition of those responsible for acts of terrorism. The Canadians did not comply. Coincidentally, it was Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, who was the Prime Minister at that time. They did not agree to that extradition, and this gentleman went on to be the mastermind behind the bombing of Air India's Kanishka flight. And even today, those perpetrators of the bombing of Kanishka that took so many lives are moving scot-free in Canada. So what sort of law and order situation is this? What sort of justice does it involve? And what sort of moral right does the representatives of this government have to ask us to produce evidence or face the consequences, push India, all measures are on the table? I mean, This is something absolutely unacceptable. I think the people of India will not accept this sort of an approach, and we have to, I think, be very resolute in pushing back against this sort of intimidation, coercion, and bullying by or attempted bullying by developed countries.
Ambassador Shringla, on the other hand, there's the very real concern of families. There are incredible links, close links. Indo-Canadians are a very prosperous part of Canadian society, extremely educated, well-to-do, and have nothing by and large to do with this Khalistani aspect of it. They have family links over here. There are any number of Indian students on visas studying in Canadian institutions which offer an excellent education. What happens to them now?
Absolutely. I think there is a very, very successful Indian-Canadian community. They have contributed very significantly to Canada's growth and development. You have, as you mentioned, a lot of Indian students who are doing their higher education in Canada and who are also contributing to the economy very, very significantly. Even among the Sikh community, the vast majority of Sikhs in Canada are people who are honest and law-abiding, who've done very well for themselves, have a strong respect for the relationship and for India. They come to visit their families here. And I think it's only a small but vocal minority that is seeking a separatist sentiment, which does not exist in India. So it's a chimerical sort of objective that you're pursuing for various reasons. And this is the constituency that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is pandering to. And I believe that the vast majority of people who are, let's say, part of that India-Canada bridge and who are part of, I would say, the success that is behind our two countries should in no way be, I would say, adversely impacted by any steps that the Canadian government, could consider taking. I think this would be detrimental to not only the interests of the two countries, but also the people-to-people contact that is so important between our two countries.
All right, Ambassador Shringla, thanks very much for joining us and sharing that standpoint. Joining us now, Dean Baxendale is a columnist in Canada, Daniel Boardman, a journalist from Canada as well, Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Ambassador of India to the United States. I'm also joined by Harsh Pant, Vice President of Studies in Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation. Dean Baxendale, Melanie Joly, the Canadian Foreign Minister, making the threat or suggesting that even sanctions could be considered in the future. Where does that help Canada? Because India is quite easily in a position to get into counter-sanctions. So wouldn't that be counterproductive?
Well, listen, thank you very much for having me on today to discuss this important, bilateral discussion with respect to, the escalation of really a significant diplomatic row that we now have between the two countries. It was obviously, brought to the Canadian public and to the world last September when Justin Trudeau stood up in Parliament and spoke to having credible evidence with respect to India's involvement and engagement with possible elements that may have resulted in the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. So where we find ourselves today in the escalation speaks to the RCMP doing a full investigation. The RCMP is not going to provide any evidence in the public domain. So Indians who are watching this broadcast are obviously asking the question, could our government have been involved in such, a situation? And certainly we find ourselves now, after 40 years of not dealing with Khalistani separatists and other diaspora elements within our own society. We have created our own tensions in our own country, and ultimately other governments are boldly engaged in Canada and foreign interference. So where does that leave us with sanctions? Yes, I don't think sanctions are an answer here, but it's clear that India and Canada, but I think India at this point needs to come to the table to have a serious discussion at this particular point, because, we have put out some fairly serious allegations. And I think that Canada is saying that India is not coming to the table. The answers are going to happen face to face and through diplomatic channels. But sanctions are certainly not the answer for either side to escalate what is a very important relationship, two-way relationship between India and Canada.
Daniel, what our sources in Delhi indicate to us is that, on the one hand, Canada calls the Indian High Commissioner a person of interest. They want to question him and several other Indian diplomats. On the other hand, it's the same diplomat, the High Commissioner, whom Ottawa has been engaging with for one entire year. All of a sudden, he becomes a person of interest. That's what sounds bizarre over here. And to even suggest that diplomatic immunity be waived so that Indian diplomats can be tried, it all sounds strange, particularly in the context of the High Commissioner.
Well, exactly. I mean, asking to waive diplomatic immunity for a country like India, especially over the Hardeep Singh Nijjar file, where, India is quite convinced that the man's a terrorist, might have something to do with his open declarations that suicide bombings against India is good and violence to take down the Indian state is necessary. That might have something to do with it. Listen, this is a problem on many different levels from the Canadian side and culture. Like, personally, I'm quite attached to the issue because I've lost a friend from foreign interference assassinations. Mehdi Amin, who was most likely murdered by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran in Richmond Hill. Canadian government didn't care, didn't budge. The judge even ruled that there was something fishy going on there. If you look at the evidence, didn't care. Karima Baloch, murdered in Toronto. We didn't care. In fact, the Toronto police said it's a suicide. What she did is she came up behind herself. She strangled herself to death, and then after she killed herself, she picked herself up and threw herself in a river, consistent with other ISI assassinations in Europe. This is what people saw in Canada prior to the Hardeep Singh Nijjar thing. So to see the Canadian government go to DEFCON 1 over the leader of the Khalistan Tiger Force is a bit enraging. And so from the Canadian perspective, those of us that follow, we've done nothing about foreign assassinations on our soil from hostile foreign governments. But now an allied foreign government is accused of it, and we are breaking all protocol. We're leaking it. We're not leaking evidence. We're just leaking accusations and trying to rope the Indian High Commissioner into this murder. And now it's not just this murder, it's every single murder. Apparently the Indian High Commission is now in charge of a massive criminal gang network across the country, extortion, murders, bribery, you name it. It's running through the Indian High Commission or through the Lawrence Bishnoi gang, even though he's in jail in India. But no, it's his deputy who's in Canada, who the Indian government's trying to extradite to India because they say he's a criminal, but we're protecting because we say he's not a criminal, but he is the criminal working with the Indian government in charge of a large, none of it makes any sense. And Melanie Joly herself has no credibility. Melanie Joly, the foreign minister, whose biggest accomplishment when she was her first accomplishment in Canadian government as heritage minister, she built an $8 million skating rink outside Parliament. And the $8 million skating rink, no one was allowed to skate on. No one was allowed to skate on it. So that was her first accomplishment. She moved up to foreign ministry, where she's now caught by Tom Mulcair, the former leader of the NDP, said that Melanie Joly told her the reason why she's taking these positions on Israel and being very anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, still has lies and blood libels up about Israel, about fake hospital bombings. She said to Mulcair that she's making foreign policy decisions based on her own domestic politics in her riding. So the foreign minister is now saying that she's making Canadian foreign policy decisions based on the radicals that she's imported in her own riding.
Right.
So how is any country supposed to take our foreign minister seriously when she says she's making decisions based on the most radical fundamentalists that they've imported in her own domestic right?
Okay, let me go across to Let me go across to Meera Shankar, former ambassador of India to the United States. In terms of hopefully an improvement in relations between India and Canada, because ultimately that has to be the goal. How is that? I don't think it's possible right now in the present juncture, but how does this potentially play out? Because it's in the interest ultimately of both nations that this gets fixed.
Look, I think there is a potential geopolitical convergence between India and Canada in the Indo-Pacific, but there are very serious differences on this whole issue of extremist activity, whether it is incitement to violence, whether it is drug running, whether it is funding acts of terrorism in India from Canadian soil. And the feeling in India is that over the years, Canada has been less than responsive to our concerns, including when you had a major act of terrorism, the Kanishka bombing, where I think internal investigation reports in Canada themselves claim that the investigation was bungled. So, and on the other hand, there is this play of domestic politics in Canada in the election season, where that becomes sometimes a driving force for what salience Canada gives to allegations it has been making against India. Now, I personally believe that megaphone diplomacy on both sides is not helpful. It just exacerbates divisions and hardens positions. I think both sides have to step back and pause and then begin a confidential dialogue, because issues like this are not going to get resolved through leveling allegations on both sides.
All right.
I think, we have to hope that Canada will show greater responsiveness to Indian concerns, and that it's not good to be blasé about attempts to break up a friend,
Right.
or to incite violence.
Sure.
And India will also look at ways in which it can have a quiet dialogue to ascertain what the truth of these allegations is.
All right, ma'am, let me just quickly go across to Harsh Pant, who's been waiting as well. I just want to, come to you in the way that we started the program with Melanie Joly saying that sanctions are on the table. Is that even a realistic threat to India at this stage?
Vishnu, when have sanctions worked even against countries who
That's
are
true.
actually...
They haven't really worked, have they?
I mean, give us one case where they've actually worked. Now, the point here is not the sanctions. I think the bigger issue here is, does this government even want a relationship with India? I mean, if you look at the commercial ties, the ambassador was talking about the geo-economic convergence, everything is in place, but everything seems to be irrelevant, because at the end of the day, the Canadian government, the Trudeau government, seems to have one particular agenda when it comes to India, and that is to do, to use the word ambassador was using, megaphone diplomacy, instead of trying to figure out what the challenges are and how do you actually navigate these challenges. You were earlier talking about how similar situations are being handled very differently by other countries. UK, US, Australia, all of them have this challenge of how do you navigate internal Sikh separatism and radicalization vis-a-vis India, and all of them are doing are treading a different route. Now suddenly you have Mr. Trudeau again, for reasons best known to him, but perhaps known to everyone else, that he is trying to make this an issue of principles where there are no principles involved. Every time he says sovereignty of Canada, you have to realize that he's also talking about sovereignty of India. He talks about how certain principles are being broken. He should realize that principles are being broken against Indians as well. So I think the broader question here is, I don't think this government wants a relationship. And let's be honest, until Mr. Trudeau is there, it's very unlikely that you will see an off-ramp here, because both Mr. Trudeau has no incentive at this point to do that, to precisely what Ambassador Veera Shankar was suggesting, to do quiet diplomacy. And India, for its own reasons, for its sensitivities involved here in India, obviously would want to push back. So I think it's a very deadly combination at this point.
All right, we'll leave it over there. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us.